Muy buenas noches, muy buenas tardes y
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin talk number 302 of Demolishing Myths talks in a special broadcast because today we're joined from from Shanghai, China, by Mr. Adrián Díaz Marro, with whom I've been wanting to have a conversation for quite some time. Hello, dear Adrián, how's everything over there?
Hola, estimado Adrián, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Hi, how are you?
Presento a Adrián muy rápidamente.
Good evening. Let me introduce Adrián very briefly. An entrepreneur, consultant, author, and also the host of a YouTube channel that bears his own name. Everyone is invited to explore it. A promoter of Chinese culture in the world, and especially in the Spanish-speaking world. Those who truly know China are rare, and those who know China through real-life experience in the country are even rarer. Adrián stands out among them as one of the few experts on China, thanks to his years of living there, in addition to all his theoretical and professional knowledge.
Además de todos sus conocimientos teóricos y profesionales. Según tu biografía, Adrián, comenzás tu
According to your biography, Adrián, you began your Chinese experience, and I want to start this conversation there before moving on to geopolitical, economic, and other issues. But I'd like to begin with your life experience in China, since interestingly, in my case as well, in 2006, just like you, Adrián, in China, well, in my case, 2006 marked the beginning of my German adventure, or misadventure. You in 2006, according to your biography, arrived in China. What did you explore from that point on? What kind of world opened up before you at that moment? And what life path have you been able to follow since then, dear Adrián?
Well, look, I arrived in China, specifically in the city of Guangzhou. At that time it was, or at least I believed it was, the most important city in China. The most economically powerful province came from there. That's where the Canton Fair was held, which back then was the spearhead of imports and exports, and China was becoming, or I thought it could become, the most important country on the planet in commercial terms, right? At that time it still wasn't, but as we've seen, it has now become so. It's the world's largest exporter, the second largest importer, and the main trading partner of about 140. The numbers vary a bit depending on which year you look at, but around 140 of the world's 200 countries already have China as their main trading partner. From there, well, projects to set up factories started coming in. I began moving inland. I left Guangzhou and went to what's often called the heart of China, and that's where I've been ever since.
Aha. And what was your perception of China at that time when you arrived, both regarding the economy and life in China? How different was it from the life you knew? Where in Spain are you from? From Catalonia, right? Or what's your background? How similar or how different was it on a personal level? What was your experience there back then?
Well, you can imagine that back then it was very different from today's China. We often say that 1 year in China is equivalent to 10 years in the West. Therefore, if 20 years have passed since then, we could say it's practically like a century in the West. In other words, the China I encountered when I arrived has absolutely nothing to do with today's China. I was going to a country that at the time was considered part of the third world, where no one spoke English, and even today, very few people do. From a foreigner's perspective, it's nothing like it was back then. Now it's full of foreigners. At that time, there were just a handful of us, and we all knew each other in cities of 8 or 10 million inhabitants. When you arrived in a city, when I told you I was moving inland, I lived in places with 1.5 million or 2 million inhabitants, and I was the only foreigner in the entire city. I was the city's mascot. And that, despite the difficulties, that nothing was tourist-friendly, that nothing was English-friendly, still had its advantages, you know? You were, as I say, that endearing being everyone wanted to pet a little, like a mascot, because you were the odd one out, right, in that place. Well, the other day I was talking about it with foreigners who have also been living here in China for many years, and they were telling me how difficult that time was. And I used to say, well, we were playing with those two realities, right? It was difficult because nothing was made for us, but at the same time, everything was made easy for us because we were very special. And the Chinese people are very friendly, very easygoing. They made everything easy for us. Nowadays, it would be the other way around. Everything has been much more adapted for foreigners. But at the same time, I wouldn't say they've grown tired of us, but we've stopped being special. We used to be rich. Now we're poor compared to them. So we're not as necessary to them anymore. Well, the motivations, the incentives, and everyone's realities have changed.
The last one about your life experience. How difficult was Chinese? And how were you able, in that context where people around you didn't know English, to establish contact with your world, with the Chinese people around you?
No, when you arrive in China, it's essential to have a translator by your side. You have to visit factories with someone who can translate for you, because otherwise it becomes unfeasible. And well, basically the cultural barrier is enormous. I usually say there's an even worse barrier, which is the cultural one, much worse than the language barrier. But well, you deal with it. Since there's goodwill on both sides, and it's a safe, friendly country, in the end, everything works out.
An example of the cultural barrier. Are they very formal or very informal? What would be a concrete example of that?
You could write book after book about the cultural barrier, but Chinese pragmatism, their way of doing business, is very straightforward. People often say the Chinese have a poker face and that we can't read them. But in reality, once you manage to cross that cultural barrier, you realize they're super easy, super direct. That thing we say about them, beating around the bush to avoid giving an answer. In fact, with the way they express things, they're telling you everything. We just don't know how to read them. And no, they're a very methodical, very pragmatic, very direct people. As I said, very focused on cost-benefit, on economic calculation. It's part of that cultural barrier we sometimes fail to cross because we come in with our preconceived notions about China.
Interesting. This pragmatism, and I'll start with questions about geopolitics. To what extent does it appear in China's current relationship with the United States? Here on our channel, we discuss geopolitical issues on a daily basis. Global geopolitics right now revolves around the confrontation between the United States and China, above all else, within a context of the rise of powers from the global south, within the BRICS framework, and the decline of the United States. All of this appears in major Western media outlets, from a so-called Western perspective. Now, what perception, what interpretation do the Chinese themselves from within China have of this confrontation with the United States? How does that appear in different spheres? And how does it also appear, Adrián, on the street, among ordinary Chinese people and their relationship with the United States, with this supposed new enemy or adversary?
Well, actually, part of your question already hinted at what I was going to say. When we talk about China, we often get into discussions and fail to understand each other because we talk about China as a single entity. But China is made up of Chinese people, Chinese companies, and the Chinese government. And sometimes we need to know how to tell the difference, right? You yourself just said, from the government, from the people, from the street. And that distinction is very important. In the case of what you're asking me right now, the answer would be the same. In other cases, it wouldn't. In other cases, what the Chinese people think or how they act is very different from how the government would like to act, or how the government would like its citizens to act. In this case, going back to the previous question and that pragmatism, the Chinese don't understand why we've gotten ourselves into a trade war. The Chinese don't understand why, from that pragmatic point of view, if there was a win-win situation, the United States, one of the countries that has grown the most in the last 40 years, and also in the last 20 and the last 10, had no need to create a competitive event and to undermine the current agreements with China. China was doing very well, but the United States has also done very well over the past 40 years. I use GDP charts for both China and the United States in some of my lectures to explain this. China obviously started from very low and has grown a lot, but the United States, being the world's leading power, finds it very difficult to remain number one and continue growing at the pace it has been growing. So the Chinese don't understand, from their pragmatic point of view, why someone who is doing well would want to kick the table over and dismantle the entire system that is making them prosper, evolve, and so on.
Well, regarding the Taiwan issue, Adrián, because that's the way it is within the framework of this US policy of direct confrontation with China. With the United States, by the way, as the promoter of this confrontation, I completely agree with your analysis. China does not want a direct confrontation with the United States. In fact, up to now, it had established a largely cooperative relationship that could indeed be described as win-win. But when the United States embarks on this collision course, or at least on a path of confrontation, it immediately intervenes in Taiwan, or establishes its presence there, because that obviously touches a sensitive nerve for China. What interpretation do the Chinese make of this US interference in Taiwan, sponsoring pro-independence parties, flirting with the idea of deploying American troops, or sending weapons? There are also sometimes semi-official visits by Taiwanese politicians to the United States, something supposedly improper, given that Taiwan represents a part of China. So such actions wouldn't be appropriate. All these things appear as provocations. But then, how is this issue of the United States viewed through Taiwan's perspective?
Through the lens of Taiwan or China, because in that case, we would have two different perspectives.
Sorry. Indeed, through the Chinese lens, but in relation to Taiwan, when the Americans established their spearhead there.
This point is interesting and it could be developed from many angles going back in time, because in every decade since 1949 we've had similar situations. That is, Taiwan has been a regular hostage of the United States in its negotiations with China. And in fact, I usually say that the biggest victim of these maneuvers is Taiwan. In other words, Taiwan and China are perfectly fine with this status quo, and it's the United States that tends to use Taiwan when it needs to turn up the volume a bit with China, and leaves Taiwan alone when things are going well with China. Taiwan is somewhat of a collateral casualty of the United States' strategies against China. I keep hearing on American news that the Chinese are going to invade Taiwan. I've been in China for 20 years, and I've been hearing that all along. But if we go back in time and look at American press coverage since 1949, every Monday afternoon the Chinese are supposedly going to invade Taiwan. It never actually happens. One day it might, and they'll say, "See, we warned you." Obviously, they've been wrongly predicting it for 70 or 75 years. In reality, from China's perspective, this kind of interference is becoming less and less tolerated. That is to say, China used to be a very weak country geopolitically, very weak militarily, but that is changing by the moment. There's an evolution, a growing evolution, where we don't know at what point China will catch up with, or has already caught up with the United States. We don't know. Since we don't know, we also don't know which verb tense we should be using. But we do know that it's very close. 50 years ago, when the United States carried out this kind of action, the Chinese would lower their heads because there was no other choice. More and more, the Chinese have less need to lower their heads. So of course this increases tensions and reignites those who say that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is imminent. Why? Because your provocations keep growing, and China keeps gaining more arguments to justify invading Taiwan, or even for a conflict to break out, or for the Americans to pull back and move away, which is what many believe could happen if that moment ever comes, in order to avoid creating a global, even nuclear, conflict. But it's true that over these 20 years, I've seen a clear evolution of that Chinese pride. From being unable to do anything when the United States carried out some similar maneuver, to it bothers us a little, to it bothers us quite a bit, to now we can stand up to the United States, watch out.
And at the level of the average Chinese person, what is their perception of the Taiwanese? We could describe ordinary Chinese people as friendly. How do they conceptualize a Taiwanese person? As someone from their own people? As a rebel? What is a Chinese person's view of a Taiwanese?
Of course, think about it. Everywhere people are manipulated. This happens from the first to the last corner of the planet, and China is no exception. So Chinese citizens also have a manipulated opinion on many issues regarding Taiwan, just as the Taiwanese must have one about China. But it's true that, aside from that manipulation, the Chinese see the Taiwanese as brothers, as another province of their country. Therefore, someone from Guangdong considers Taiwan a sister province, just as they would consider someone from Beijing. What is considered, and here's where some manipulation may come in, is that the Taiwanese would want to be Chinese just like any other province. But they aren't because of their leaders. That's where the manipulation lies. Because obviously in Taiwan people vote, they have voted, and the results are becoming more evenly split, closer to 50-50. But it's true that until recently, until a few decades ago, there was a clear majority of pro-independent citizens, even though this wasn't perceived from China. From China, there's a lot of affection for the Taiwanese. In fact, the experiences people in China have with Taiwan are of Taiwanese coming to do business, and they are very well received. No longer businessmen, which is what I mostly came across, those who were China's big investors at the end of the last century, but singers, actors, just to give you an idea. My name in Chinese, I'm Adrián, was unpronounceable, and my teacher translated it the first time as I De Lian. But that was 4 syllables and very hard for the Chinese, so I kept the last part, Lian. Well, Lian, my Chinese name, is the name of Ang Li, who is a Taiwanese director. The first time they gave it to me, because your name is given to you by another Chinese person, I thought, this is going to cause conflict. How does a foreigner come to China and take the name of a famous Taiwanese person? It's like saying, I'm going to brag about being your enemy or something like that. But I was the only one who thought that. No Chinese person would think that. So, every time I tell a Chinese person my name, they get really happy. A smile appears on their face and they say, "Ah, like the Taiwanese director." That's not something they explain to us that way in the West. We'd think the opposite. We'd think what I thought when I was given that name, right? Not at all. The Chinese are very proud of Taiwan's achievements. Taiwan's Olympic medals are celebrated as Chinese. It's quite curious, isn't it? Because there are countries in the world where, if there are separatist regions, the country doesn't celebrate that region's successes as a way of rebelling against those who don't want to be part of it, right? In China, it's the complete opposite. Taiwan, which competes in the Olympic Games under a different flag, has its successes celebrated by mainland Chinese, who are genuinely happy because to them, it's other Chinese winning medals.
Adrián, y esto mismo con respecto a
Adrián, and regarding Japan, both from the state level and from ordinary Chinese people, what kind of relationship do they have with the Japanese, considering the tragic history between the two countries? Well, the Japanese invasions, the number of Chinese who were killed, the atrocities committed by Japan in China, as in so many other places, including South Korea. But what is the relationship with the Japanese, both from the leader's perspective and that of the average Chinese person?
En la visión de los dirigentes como en el chino de a pie.
Mira, es muy interesante. Yo explico los chinos.
Look, it's very interesting. I always explain that the Chinese are the most pragmatic people on the planet, completely rational. Unlike, for example, the Spanish, the Latins, the Arabs, or the Mediterraneans. There are certain peoples in the world who are very emotional, very hot-blooded. I always say the Chinese are the most pragmatic people that exist, with two exceptions. There are two things that break that pragmatism. One is superstition, and the other is Japan. With Japan, that pragmatism breaks down, rationality disappears, emotion takes over, and everything you could spend hours explaining about what the Chinese are like falls apart. All of that goes out the window if we bring up Japan, because suddenly they change and become someone else.
The
most apolitical person you could meet in China, someone who knows absolutely nothing about politics and doesn't want to know or talk about any political topic, will completely change if the subject of Japan comes up. This happens often. I sometimes say, the Chinese don't hate Americans, contrary to what we're often told on TV. All that US anti-China propaganda didn't exist before. It's starting now and growing, but it didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago. Zero. Now it's beginning, but it's minimal. The Chinese don't hate Americans because they don't see them as their natural enemy. They're too far away. Americans are used to fighting thousands, even tens of thousands of miles away from their borders. The Chinese are not. The Chinese have historically had problems with their neighbors. Well, the enemy is Japan, and that's where there's a real historical grudge. Because the Japanese do not acknowledge all the massacres and the series of actions they carried out in China during the Sino-Japanese War. And it doesn't seem like an agreement is possible. Because it's true that as the Chinese position themselves as a global hegemon, they also tell the story, as I said. All countries manipulate it to our advantage. The Chinese do too.
Todos los países manipulamos a nuestro favor, los chinos también. Todos los países con los que hables siempre.
Every country you talk to, always. When they've invaded, it was for a logical reason. When they've been invaded, it was for a horrible reason. When we've killed, it was for their own good. But when we've been killed, they were savages. Well, the Chinese manipulate things that way too. And so we've reached a point where we've taken to the extreme the massacres and atrocities committed by the Japanese, to the point that the Japanese will never admit that, will never accept that. So that creates a difficult issue. Well, it honestly can't be resolved.
No se puede resolver, sinceramente.
Yes, with the rise to power in Japan of Takaichi, a leader from Japan's nationalist right who promotes Imperial Japan, Japanese history, and a process of remilitarization, tensions began. An escalation appeared, we witnessed an escalation, and in this case, the United States intervened. Apparently, Trump called Takaichi to calm the situation a bit. Considering your description, Adrián, could it be that a conflict between China and Japan actually seems more likely, though still not very likely, but still more likely than a conflict with Taiwan, due to this history and the Chinese perception of both Taiwan and Japan?
Es difícil cuantificar cuánto más probable.
It's difficult. It's difficult to quantify how much more likely a conflict with Japan would be than with Taiwan. It's true that once again we can see that Chinese pragmatism. The Chinese are never the ones who provoke, that's true. It's like what we did as kids saying, he started it, and every kid always tries to make the other one the guilty party. In China's case, and I'm trying to be as objective as I can, it's true, that is, suddenly the president of Japan makes statements about Taiwan that no one asked for, and that aren't a response to anything the Chinese had said. The Chinese didn't even know that woman existed, but suddenly she shows up, talks to the press, talks to her audience, and those statements reach China. Then there's a reaction from China, exactly like you mentioned when the Americans send diplomats to visit Taiwan, or suddenly sell a batch of missiles to Taiwan. That's never due to a prior provocation from China. China is fine as it is with that status quo. So how likely, or how much more likely, is a war with Japan or an invasion of Taiwan? Well, it depends on who provokes China first, because it doesn't depend on China in either case. So, if the United States is already putting all its chips on Taiwan and says we're going to provoke China, will that make the Chinese attack Taiwan? Because, in the end, there's a level of militarization that at some point will become unbearable for the Chinese. Just like the Americans wouldn't like to have, I don't know, another Cuban Missile Crisis. They don't like having nuclear weapons at the doorstep of the United States. Well, there will come a time when China says, we don't like having this kind of missiles or this kind of weaponry on China's border. Or even within Chinese territory, which is how Taiwan is considered and how the United States recognizes Taiwan as part of a single China. So there will come a time when that provocation becomes unbearable. If the Japanese are going to provoke from another front and shift the conflict toward Japan, I find it hard to say. I don't know Japan well enough to have an opinion on that. What I do know is that it certainly won't come from any internal Chinese need. Not at all. What China wants is as much global stability as possible in order to keep trading, to trade more and better, and to grow wealthier.
Speaking of provocations, I now recall, following your comments, that the latest escalation in the Taiwan issue began during Biden's administration with Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. That was the restart of the Taiwan escalation. And if we go back a little further, the beginning of the open confrontation between the United States and China also arose from an American provocation, or at least from the US initiative to impose tariffs during Trump's first administration. Indeed, China does not generate provocations or conflicts on its own initiative, but rather responds to situations created by others, without a doubt. But beyond that, you constantly emphasize the issue of pragmatism. And precisely that pragmatism appears in China's policy regarding its economic system from Deng Xiaoping onward. This is what they call the Chinese miracle. The elimination of millions of poor people and their incorporation into a consumer society. Could you briefly recap what has happened in China economically since the late 1970s up to now? What do they, or we, mean by the Chinese miracle, and how much pragmatism is there in it?
Yes, well, Deng Xiaoping's measures were approved at the end of 1979 and began to be implemented in the 1980s. It was certainly a gradual process, so in the early years, not everything was approved at once. Also, at the beginning, Deng Xiaoping faced a lot of opposition within the party itself. That is, the measures were approved little by little. But we already start to see the results in the 1990s, with tremendous GDP growth, and even more so in the 2000s. I usually say that around 2009 or 2010 is when China overtook Japan as the world's second largest power, leaving only the United States ahead. In fact, China overtook the United States in 2014 in terms of GDP adjusted for purchasing power parity, a figure that to me is much more relevant than GDP itself, but one that gets much less attention precisely because otherwise we'd have to acknowledge that China is already the world's leading power. In case someone in your audience doesn't know, GDP adjusted for purchasing power parity means that we don't just measure GDP, but we adjust it according to each country's prices. In other words, earning $1,000 in a poor country is not the same as earning $1,000 in a rich one. It's not the same to earn $1,000 if your rent costs $100 as it is if your rent costs $1,000. So all your income would go toward your rent, right? Well, compared to prices in China, which is how I think it should be looked at, and the United States compared to prices in the United States, and Russia compared to prices in Russia, China has been the world's leading economic power since 2014. Well, as you were saying, all this began in 1979 with a series of economic liberalizations with massive privatization of public companies. More than 100,000 public companies were privatized, which accounted for 2/3 of the Chinese economy. What were called, or came to be called, islands of freedom were created, special economic zones where wild capitalism was practiced. There was zero regulation, zero labor rights, 0, and that's when foreign companies started coming in to invest, to set up their factories. I told you before that Taiwanese entrepreneurs were very welcome. Why? Because for many years, and a lot of people don't know this, the biggest foreign investor in China wasn't the United States or Europe, it was Taiwan. In other words, a tiny little country, a small island in the Pacific that seemed insignificant, was actually the largest foreign investor in China. Since they didn't have formal relations, they had to do it through Hong Kong. Well, there were different channels to route that Taiwanese investment, but that's how it was. And that's why the first special economic zone, the most famous one, is Shenzhen, which was on the border with Hong Kong, because the goal was to create a Hong Kong within China, and that's what Shenzhen became. So the Hong Kongers, with Taiwanese capital, moved their factories there. Before everything was made in China, it was made in Hong Kong, made in Taiwan. The older members of your audience will remember that. And those factories that once produced made in Taiwan, made in Hong Kong goods are the ones that moved to China, to those special economic zones. Why? Why did this phenomenon occur? Very simple, because the Taiwanese, who were the economic power of that time, the productive powerhouse, so to speak, we always ask, who will be the new China? Well, old China was Taiwan. They found themselves with a limited country, without as much labor as they would have liked to keep growing. And suddenly an entire continent opened up before them. A country 200 times the size of Taiwan, with the same language, the same culture, and a wild capitalism. Just what Deng Xiaoping was proposing at the time, where they were welcomed and had an endless field for development. That's why they set up their factories there. And the Chinese, who were cautious because they didn't know if that kind of capitalism would work, that leap from extreme communism to extreme capitalism, once they saw that those little islands of freedom worked, What happened was that Chinese people started crowding against the fences of those islands trying to cross to the other side, because anyone who managed to get inside a special economic zone earned several times more than the rest of the Chinese. Wages were several orders of magnitude higher. So in the end, what China does is extend that economic freedom to the entire country. Many people still think that in China there's only a kind of capitalism within certain specific regions, free trade zones or those special economic zones. Not at all. Nowadays, there's no difference. There might be some kind of tax advantage, but I, for example, work on setting up companies for foreigners, and I never pay special attention to the special economic zones for their economic benefits. They're not relevant. We can set up companies anywhere in the country, and all of them are equally functional from the entrepreneur's point of view.
In that
context of capitalist development in China, in some of your videos, you describe China as a fully market-based, fully capitalist economic system, perhaps even hyper-capitalist. Is that interpretation of your words correct? Could you explain this in a bit more detail?
Yes, because, well, we're victims of the two most powerful propaganda machines on the planet, the American one and nowadays the Chinese one. And both sides, the Americans to denigrate the Chinese and the Chinese to boast about their system, call China a communist country or a socialist country, or that socialism with Chinese characteristics, or a bunch of other attempts to explain something that's much easier to understand when you live inside China. The truth is, China went from one extreme to the radically opposite one, from extreme communism to wild capitalism. So this is quite inexplicable for the average Chinese person.
Deng
Xiaoping had to face all the party cadres. He was accused of being counter-revolutionary. So he had to find a way to explain that what he was going to do, the changes that were to be implemented, did not mean going to the opposite extreme, but were part of a more calculated process of the initial development planned from the beginning. And since the Chinese have continued to call themselves communists and socialists, and to speak of that socialism with Chinese characteristics, and from the outside that has served quite well to keep denigrating them, we've been left with that rhetoric from both sides. But when you work in China, operate in China, and see how things are here, I, moreover, not only work or am an entrepreneur in China, but I've also dedicated myself to setting up factories. When you run a Chinese factory, it completely changes everything you thought you knew about China, even after living here for several years. When I set up my first factory, when I saw it from the inside, because it was very different to go buy from factories, to see them from the outside, you could get an idea. But when you run a factory from the inside, in China, suddenly it's like another layer of knowledge unlocks, and it's a much thicker layer than all the others.
Factories in the industrial sense, right, Adrián? All these ventures, both yours and the ones you just mentioned from other people, are they all connected to production, or do some of them also follow the logic of the financialization of the economy?
Well, obviously there are different sectors in China, different practices. I focus more on the industrial field throughout my life, and also on services, architecture and design services, which are also connected, let's say, to industry. But of course there are Chinese companies in every field, and the financial sector has also grown.
What is the difference in the way of working between a Chinese industrial company and a European industrial company? If not Spanish, then German.
It's like comparing soccer to golf. They have nothing to do with each other. I wouldn't even know where to start. To begin with, the attitude of business owners and the attitude of workers are completely different from one place to another. Business owners are there to make money. It's hard to believe that this needs to be defined as something very different from what happens in the West. But the feeling I get, I used to be an entrepreneur in the West, so I more or less know how a Western entrepreneur thinks, even though I've spent most of my life in China. An entrepreneur in the West, in Spain for example, I'll give you an example from my own experience, came from a time when people would say that 8 out of 10 businesses that open close before their first year. Of the other 2 companies, in the first 5 years, if you manage to break even, you can already consider yourself satisfied. Of course, when I arrived in China, they told me, "You're crazy. In China, if we don't double before the first 6 months, we shut down the company." So of course there's a different ambition, different challenges. The goal of a company is to deal with bureaucracy. It feels like this when a client who's an architect comes to me and says they want to start an architecture firm. I tell them, if you want to be an architect, don't start an architecture firm, work for others. If you start an architecture firm, you'll never work as an architect again in your life. You'll spend your time dealing with bureaucracy. You'll become a business person. You'll stop being an architect. Not in China. In China, if someone wants to start a screw factory because they're really good at making screws, they'll start a screw factory and be the owner making screws, because they can focus 100% on it. That's from the entrepreneur's side. From the worker's side, it's also completely different. The Chinese worker comes to a factory to make money, to work as many hours as possible. In factories, the few that remain in the West, a worker is looking for a stable job with a long-term contract that guarantees security, if possible, to work 35 hours a month. Sorry, a week. What rights do I have in this factory? What breaks are there? How often do we stop? How much vacation time is there? The mindset of a Chinese person who wants to work to earn money has absolutely nothing to do with that of a Westerner who wants a job in order to have a life beyond that job.
Very interesting description. Now, politically speaking, Adrián, there are clearly differences between China and the global north. Just as you describe the Chinese economy as hyper-capitalist, its political system does not display the characteristics, at least, of the free, liberal democracies of the global north, the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, and so on. What characteristics does the Chinese political system have, and what relationship exists between this political system, which differs from the Western one, and this Chinese hyper-capitalism?
First of all, let me tell you, when I say that there is wild capitalism in China, it's not because it resembles the West, but precisely because it doesn't. I don't think there's any kind of capitalism in the West, or at least nothing like what exists in China. To begin with, when you tell me that the political system doesn't resemble the Western one, no, neither does the economic model. So if we look at the political system, what I always try to do is distinguish between the political system and the economic model. Why? Because that's what causes confusion. And many people say, of course, what Adrián doesn't understand is that the economic model is capitalist, but the political system is communist. This makes no sense at all. Communism is another economic model, and it is not practiced in China. So what exists as a political system in China is authoritarianism. China has an authoritarian political system, as you rightly said, that is completely different from liberal democracies. It's an authoritarian political system with an ultra-capitalist economic model. Every time we see something we call communism, because they pass a law that changes the rules of the game somewhere else, what they're actually applying is their authoritarianism. That is, that idea that works like a company, where the CEO speaks, the leader speaks, and everyone else obeys, because there is no democracy, certainly. But that's not telling me anything about the economic model. It's telling me something about the discipline imposed by an authoritarian system. So of course the Chinese system has absolutely nothing to do with liberal democracies or practically any other system in the world, because it's also very distinctive. I talk a lot about authoritarianism because people often say the Chinese dictatorship, and I try to be precise with terms and oppose the term dictatorship. Because a dictatorship requires a dictator, and in China there is no dictator. Then they say no, but we mean dictatorship as a party dictatorship. Well, you can call it whatever you want, but there isn't a dictator in the usual sense. There is a single party, certainly, and that single party is authoritarian. Of course, when we try to compare China with dictatorships, we stumble in those comparisons precisely because there's no dictator. So it can't be compared with Castro's Cuba, it can't be compared with North Korea, it can't be compared with any of that, because that figure simply doesn't exist. Sometimes I also, just to poke a little, I have that slightly irreverent side, usually say, China has had more presidents since 1980 than most democracies in the world. It had more different presidents. So we can get that idea of dictatorship out of our heads a bit, right? China has had one party that has appointed different presidents. It's true that the last one extended the possibility of staying in power beyond 2 terms. We'll see where this leads. But until that change in the law, which happened 2, 3, maybe 4 years ago, Chinese presidents served 2 terms, and that was it. They didn't have fathers and sons, like in the United States. They didn't have husband and wife, like in Argentina. They weren't family dynasties, like in some Central American countries. Or a person like the Spanish president couldn't stay in office, I don't know, 12 years, 15 years, 16 years, or like some presidents of autonomous communities in Spain who have been in office for 30 years. As I said, China has had more different presidents than most democracies in the world, and that alone should make us reflect on what kind of dictatorship we have here then. But it's true that that one-party authoritarian regime sets it apart from any other country in the world and gives it a series of advantages and disadvantages. On my channel, I talk a lot about those advantages.
Yo en mi canal hablo mucho sobre esas ventajas. Por ejemplo, en China no hay ese cortoplacismo al que nos enfrentamos.
For example, in China, there isn't that short-term mindset that democracies push us toward. Western politicians usually take actions that produce results within their 4-year terms, so they can sell those successes ahead of the next elections. This is one of the endemic problems of democracy. That doesn't exist in China. In China, also because of their sense of time and their 4,000-year history, they have a much more long-term vision. And this helps them later in other kinds of discussions, right? In energy policy, in geostrategy, in geopolitics, and so on.
Well, the last part of your answer was lost due to the connection, but only a couple of words. I've understood the concept without a doubt. What is the relationship, Adrián, between this hyper-capitalist economic system, different from Western capitalism, which is much more restrained than this Chinese hypercapitalism, and that Chinese political system, which is different from liberal democracies and authoritarian? What is the relationship between the two? Or, to make the question more concrete, is the Chinese Communist Party permeated by business people, by the big Chinese entrepreneurs? Does it follow the orders of the major Chinese capital holders? That's one side of it. And on the other, in the Chinese economic system, in that hyper-capitalist economy, to what extent do politicians or the Chinese state itself participate in the economy, in various ways from within?
A la primera pregunta, No.
To the first question, no. Chinese leaders are not seen as being pressured by business people, and this is often presented as that communist success, that in China, the state is not at the service of capital, unlike in the United States, where the state supposedly is at the service of capital. We could debate that. I don't think any state is at the service of capital. I believe states are powerful, and I think the United States is the most powerful state. No, personally, we can discuss that, but I don't think the state in the United States is at the service of capital, and neither is it in China, obviously.
Estado esté al servicio de los capitales, en China tampoco, evidentemente. Pero por pura lógica, porque en todo caso...
But purely by logic, because in any case, if we've seen that the fundamental difference in the Chinese system is that it's authoritarian, that it's not democratic, therefore there are no elections, therefore you don't have to sell yourself to your voters, therefore you don't need the capital that business people offer you to run mega campaigns or to clean up your image so you can run for office. It's normal that the toxic relationship that exists in the West doesn't exist there. But, from my point of view, that has nothing to do with the economic model. It has to do with the political system. That is, when your authority doesn't depend on elections, you no longer need that money to make the outcome of those elections better or worse. That's from the perspective of whether politics is coerced by economic power. And, excuse me, what was the second question?
Y me disculpa, ¿cuál era la segunda pregunta?
No, and vice versa. To what extent is the economic system also permeated by the political system?
Sí, eso también es otra de las cosas que se habla mucho y que intentas...
Yes, that's also one of the things people talk about a lot, and it tries to be an opposing idea to this wild capitalism, what happens with the big Chinese corporations. And indeed they exist. There are a number of strategic sectors. Most of them tend to be monopoly enterprises that the state controls, that the state reserves for its own management. The military, energy, banking. There are several sectors that are directly managed by the state, and the private sector doesn't enter there. That represents roughly the entire state sector, including state-owned enterprises, about 1/3 of the economy, and 2/3 of the economy are private. So that's the relationship. If you compare this with the West, the influence of the Chinese state is actually much smaller than that of any Western country.
La influencia del Estado chino es mucho menor que la de cualquier país occidental. Lo que ocurre es que el Estado chino no tiene un Estado...
What happens is that the Chinese state doesn't have a welfare state, or at least not one as heavy as those in European countries, or even the United States. Even though we're often told that the United States has zero welfare state, in reality it has a much stronger one than China. So what's going on? That third of the economy in which the Chinese state intervenes consists of direct interventions in industry, infrastructure, and a series of factors that obviously reshape the country's industrial landscape. So of course the state has an impact there, because its weight isn't based on redistribution or social policies, but on direct intervention in the economy.
Bien, pero aún así vos rechazás la tesis...
All right, but even so, you reject the thesis that China's success is due to independent state intervention in the economy. In a hyper-capitalist economy, that's obvious. But for you, in that distinction, those who present that thesis are mistaken, right? Could you explain this a bit more in detail?
¿Verdad? ¿Podrías presentar esto un poquito más en detalle?
Sí, absolutamente.
Yes, absolutely. Basically, that third of the state economy is often credited with the success of the Chinese economy. But we fail to understand that when the state share was 100%, China was the poorest country on the planet by far. Not only the poorest on the planet, but the poorest in history. In the first 30 years of communism, China's wealth fell to 15th century levels. The most severe famines in human history occurred. According to the Chinese government, 30 million deaths. According to Western figures, between 70 and 80 million deaths.
Según cifras occidentales, entre 70 y 80 millones de muertos. Fue un desastre absoluto. Entonces, desde 19...
And it was an absolute disaster. So from 1979, when the role of the state began to shrink, until 2001 or 2002, when the state represented 10% of the economy, that is, there is no smaller state in the world today than China's was when it was growing at double digits. That to me is proof that those double-digit growth rates were not due to that 10% state presence at the time, but rather to the privatization of those 100,000 state-owned companies and the retention of only the essential ones.
Sí, Adrián, ¿puedo una pequeña interrupción? Ahora, ¿y si ese éxito...
Adrian, may I make a small interruption? Now, what if that success, instead of being the result of the Chinese state's intervention through state-owned enterprises, actually stemmed from the Chinese state's regulatory intervention capacity? A counterexample would be two different crises, two financial and later economic crises, first in the United States and then in Europe. But above all, it begins in the United States in 2008-2009 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, one of the major investment banks at the time. The US government intervened at the taxpayer's expense, with an enormous cost to bail out the financial system. A bailout that, instead of creating conditions for a financial system somewhat less prone to harmful hyperspeculation, will soon lead to another explosion of one of the many financial bubbles in the US economy.
Una de las tantas burbujas financieras de la economía estadounidense, en lugar de eso realiza un salvataje a favor de las empresas financieras.
Instead, it carries out a bailout in favor of financial companies, not for the continuity of the economic cycle, and even less for American citizens. Meanwhile, on the other hand, I recall the Chinese government's intervention in the Evergrande crisis, in the Chinese real estate system, in which, well, a very large real estate company in China, which produces an enormous number of housing units and fulfills its role as a housing producer quite well, was at the same time accumulating debt. At one point, it declared a default, a crisis began, and the Chinese state intervened, not by expropriating the company, but by supporting state banks so that they would not withdraw financing for construction projects.
El financiamiento de las construcciones.
It also participates through regional governments to prevent already initiated real estate investment projects from being deactivated. Well, it carries out a lot of indirect interventions with the goal that, beyond Evergrande, housing production and that economic cycle do not disappear, but rather that the flow of the economy is restored with undoubtedly high growth rates, and in this case, with large-scale, ongoing housing construction. So between these two experiences, there does seem to be a difference in the way the state intervenes.
In
the United States, quite simply, bailouts are for the financial elite, not for the citizens or the economy as a whole. Whereas in China, apparently, state intervention does aim to diffuse the crises inherent to a superpowered market economy, one with enormous potential, but also with the potential for crisis and self-destruction without such state intervention. Could it be that part of the success of this Chinese combination between a hyper-capitalist economy and a more or less independent political system lies there?
A ver, has tocado muchos temas.
Let's see, you've touched on many topics. With all due respect, I'm going to disagree on a number of points. Go ahead, explain it as you do. For me, precisely, the Evergrande case is the opposite example. The United States intervenes, as you rightly say, to save the financial world, the lobbies, friends of the government, and so on. That to me is wrong. But let's go further back. There are basically two types of worldviews, and now we'll see that China represents a third. The two main worldviews, between left and right, in a crisis like the one the United States is experiencing, are as follows. The left says, let's save the banks, but let's nationalize them. What the right says is, let's save the banks, and basically what they do is privatize the profits but socialize the losses, which is what we experienced in the United States, not in China. In China, they don't say, let's save and nationalize, or let's save and let that corrupt financial system keep the profits. In China, what they say is we don't intervene. That's where I draw the contrast. And what China does is let Evergrande fall precisely because it doesn't intervene. What would have been done in the United States is to save Evergrande with public money and let Evergrande continue operating as a private company. What some political parties, for example in Spain, who defended it, would have done is nationalize Evergrande. That's what left-wing parties in Spain, for example, defended regarding Spanish banks. What China is doing is letting Evergrande fall, not intervening, precisely. Then what you've interpreted, on the other hand, is that there is intervention through a series of measures, easing the way banks lent money, and in that way sustaining and creating a soft landing for that supposed Chinese real estate bubble. It can be interpreted in two ways. From the point of view of those who favor interventionism, we could say that the Chinese state is intervening in the banking sector, not in companies like Evergrande, but in the banks themselves. From my point of view, it's modifying its previous intervention. That is to say, it's possible that even though the banking system is not 100%, but let's put it that way, 100% state-owned, much of that real estate problem may have been caused by that state banking system. Therefore, what the Chinese government is doing is readjusting, let's say fine-tuning the regulations that govern that banking system to deal with a problem they themselves created. So, well, everything can be seen from different perspectives. Personally, I really like that they let Evergrande fall. I really like that they didn't intervene. Very important companies have gone under in China. And the first rule of capitalism tells you this: good ideas stay and bad ones disappear.
Las buenas ideas se quedan y las malas desaparecen. Y Evergrande era una mala idea. Por tanto,
and Evergrande was a bad idea, therefore it had to disappear. This is the handbook of the perfect capitalist. This is what isn't applied in the West. Many people who are against capitalism are actually against what is practiced in the United States, which to me has nothing to do with capitalism. When corporate profits are privatized but losses are socialized, that to me has nothing to do with capitalism. So I understand your comparative point between China and the United States. For me, what's disastrous is what's practiced in the United States. But well, we can fine-tune those points and agree on the essence.
Yes, now, in your analysis of Evergrande's collapse, and apologies to the audience if we're focusing on something very specific, here we have a very interesting case to examine that uniquely Chinese hybrid, an economic system with certain characteristics, and a political system with others. State intervention doesn't exactly aim to reactivate the economic cycle, to restart the real estate capital cycle in order to produce housing for that purpose. But rather, it's not about rescuing the capitalists themselves.
Yes, but what I'm trying to tell you is this. Companies are allowed to fail. There's no intervention to save companies, no intervention to rescue them. Laws are changed to reorganize that supposed bubble, or that, if we want to call it, real estate crisis, yes. But keep in mind that the real estate sector is heavily regulated in China. That one is indeed intervened, and the banking system is 100% state-owned. In other words, it's not that the state is intervening in the private economy to redirect it, because the private economy is a mess. In my view, it's intervening in one of the major problems caused by the Chinese banking system. The Chinese banking system, which is state-owned, in my view, is responsible for China's two biggest problems. One is the real estate bubble, or the so-called real estate bubble, and the other is local government debt. That's caused by a state sector that is almost 100% controlled, which is the Chinese state banking system. So of course, to me, this reintervention within the banking sector doesn't indicate that the state is stepping in to reorganize the private economy, but rather to correct mistaken decisions, or decisions that time has forced to be adjusted in this regard.
en este sentido.
Bien.
Y también,
Okay.
cuando estaba explicando, volviendo...
And also, when I was explaining, going back 2 or 3 questions, the history of China's evolution and why, when they were growing at double digits, they reduced the state to a minimum. The other argument that I find fundamental, after these 2 decades I've spent in China analyzing what I've experienced, is that Chinese growth, the spectacular growth, is exactly the same if we look at the best 40 years of Japan, the best 40 years of Taiwan, the best 40 years of Singapore, South Korea, and Hong Kong. The 4 Asian dragons in Japan, the best 40 years of each of those countries are identical to China's best 40 years.
Son idénticos a los 40 mejores años chinos. Con esto lo que quiero decir es, hay algo...
What I mean by this is that there's something that has nothing to do with the political system or the economic model. There's something else in this part of the planet that should explain this almost identical evolution of these countries. It's not identical because it didn't happen in the same years, but let's say those 40 years from poverty to wealth are the same. Therefore, I think we should separate our own emotional, ideological component that makes us try to explain China, always, and we all do this, through our prior bias. Because the same explanation should work if we replace the name China with Japan, or if we replace China with Korea. And clearly they haven't had the same political systems. Therefore, there's something else we're not managing to understand, which has been the key to these countries' success, a success that continues to be replicated in Asia. That is, the next countries, the best area in the world right now, the best region in the world, is Southeast Asia. The model that enriched Japan, that enriched Korea, that enriched Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore continues to be replicated. And today it's being replicated in Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and so on. So is there something more than whether the Chinese state is big or small? Is there something more than whether the Chinese economy is ultra-capitalist or not so capitalist, and so on?
Bien. Y si acompaño tu interpretación,
All right. And if I go along with your interpretation, then that something more would appear in this culture of enrichment, of progress, in that sense, right? That's your perspective.
Esa tu perspectiva.
Yes, yes. For me, there are a number of elements. I try to look at what has been repeated in all these countries over all these years, without exceptions. That is, if at any point, and this is what we try to do, just as scientists do with the scientific method, one tries to falsify an argument. In other words, if my thesis doesn't hold true in any of the experiments, my thesis loses its strength. So, what has been repeated in each of these countries? And maybe there are more things that have been repeated that I can't see, or that no one can see, or that some people can't see. But there are a number of things that we can see.
Pero hay una serie de cosas que sí podemos ver, y ha sido una seguridad.
And it has been an important legal certainty that welcomes foreign investment, a strong capacity for work and sacrifice, a concrete ethic toward work, and in general toward life. So I believe there is a set of values, ways of understanding life, that are present in all these countries and not in the rest of the world. And we can find common ground there. In fact, even I, in the studies I've done, can separate the Chinese ethnicity in some Southeast Asian countries and find valid correlations. That is, in Indonesia, there is 1% of Chinese.
En los países Indonesia. En Indonesia hay un 1% de chinos. Ese 1% controla...
That 1% controls almost 3/4 of Indonesia's economy. The concept is brutal. In Malaysia, about 30% are of Chinese origin, and they have a level of control that's not as extreme but still enormous over the country's economy. In Singapore, the population is practically Chinese, and we can see Singapore's success. In Thailand, there's also a percentage of Chinese people, and when you interact with them, I often have to go to Thailand because many factories have already moved there. You realize you're interacting with Chinese people. They have Thai passports, but they define themselves as Chinese. So you start finding a series of very interesting traits even in countries whose origins are different from China's.
Yes, perhaps a common trait shared by the Korean and Japanese cases is that neither of those successful examples of economic development was characterized by a highly democratic political system in liberal Western terms, right? Neither the Korean, nor the Japanese, nor the Chinese. Another element as well.
Not even the Taiwanese, which we often forget. I often forget about the China-Taiwan discussion. Sometimes people tell me, no, we support Taiwan because it's a democracy. Taiwan was a dictatorship until the 1990s. In fact, at certain times it was a brutal dictatorship. So, can we agree? Can we be more pro-Taiwan than pro-China? For whatever reasons we want, but let's not lie to ourselves. We were already pro-Taiwan when it was a brutal dictatorship. As you say, following the example of Japan and Korea, Taiwan is another dictatorial example, whether people like it or not, but a successful one.
All right, what are China's problems right now, Adrián? What's changing? How would you conceptualize the problems of present-day China from whichever angle you prefer? Economic, political, social, or cultural? Where do China's current challenges appear?
Well, no country is perfect. Each has its own challenges. For example, the most famous one, perhaps the most mentioned outside of China, would be the demographic challenge. That is, the Chinese are not having children. It's often said that China is an aged country. That's not true. It's a very, very young country, but it's a country that is aging. That's different from being aged. In other words, the children that would be needed are not being born today, which means we are aging now. Tomorrow, we will indeed be an aged country. So this is a huge problem that, well, I've discussed it extensively in my videos because maybe it's not as serious as it's portrayed in the West. It's a serious problem for sure, but we tend to look at China through Western eyes. Naturally, we have our own biases. So what's happening here? As I said at the beginning, China doesn't have a social welfare state as developed as Western countries do. Therefore, the biggest problem a Western country faces with a demographic crisis, for example, is public pensions. We need a broader base of the pyramid to meet future commitments. China doesn't have that. Obviously, it has pensions, but not everyone receives them, and in many cases, they're negligible. So that problem is much smaller than in countries like the United States or Spain, for instance. Moreover, China is the country that is automating its industry the most.
China es el país que más está automatizando su industria. Entonces, yo suelo decir...
So, I usually say that there are two problems on the horizon that we see in most Western debates. One is, robots are going to take our jobs, and the other is, we don't have enough children to one day work and generate our pensions. I often say that those two problems, conveniently synchronized, could solve each other. That is, the children we're not having could be replaced by robots, and those robots wouldn't be taking anyone's job. Well, it's very difficult to synchronize these two issues logically because each follows its own agenda. But if there's an authoritarian country capable of synchronizing that by law with a firm hand, it would be China. So we can see that China, despite the fact that officially more than 10 million people have lost their jobs due to robotization, and unofficially 30 million, is the country suffering the most from robotization, and at the same time, the one betting on it the most. Again, this is because there is no state intervention to protect workers. Instead, the market is left to automate, and we'll see how things turn out. What has happened? Thanks to that freedom, companies have invested so much in it. They are automating so much, but at the same time growing so much in volume that those 30 million unemployed people have been retrained into other positions. And today, unemployment in China, despite those 30 million lost jobs, is negative. That is, it's structural unemployment, but deep down, it's negative.
decir, es un empleo estructural, pero en el fondo es negativo. Tenemos falta de trabajadores en China.
We have a shortage of workers in China. This is another one of those myths that fits perfectly with the title of your channel. I focus on refuting that. In China, with 1.5 billion people, do you really need workers? Yes, we do need workers. We have a labor shortage precisely because the economy is working, not as well as I'd like, but well enough, for unemployment to be negative, and for many industries to lack the workers they need. So, there are a number of issues in China, as is logical. A series of challenges. Automation and demographics would be two of them. But, as I said, conveniently synchronized, I believe the country that can best and most effectively synchronize them, thanks to its authoritarianism, is China.
Gracias a ese autoritarismo los puede sincronizar es China. Más allá de esto, tenemos problemas mundiales.
Beyond that, we have global problems. I often say that democracy is a problem for China, but not because it doesn't exist in China, but because it exists in other countries. Since every 4 years politicians have to lie to voters to win elections, it's very common for China's name to appear in other countries' campaigns as a weapon to gain votes. We saw it in the 2 elections Trump won, and we see it in Latin American countries when they want to talk about Chinese fishing fleets, Chinese imports, or any other related issue. That's negative for China. It's a challenge they must address through diplomacy.
Es negativo para China. Eso es un reto que tienen que solucionar con diplomacia. China, bajo mi punto de vista, tiene una mala diplomacia.
China, from my point of view, has poor diplomacy and poor marketing. Those would be other areas to improve. People often talk about the Chinese propaganda system. Official propaganda to me is quite the opposite. The most effective official propaganda in the world is American propaganda. Chinese propaganda is terrible. That's why we constantly get absurd news about China. That's why I at least started my channel, to refute all those absurd stories we hear every day about China. Because China doesn't have a propaganda machine good enough to compete with the American one. And well, I could go on talking about different problems.
Bueno, te podría seguir hablando de diferentes problemas.
A short one about the first of the problems mentioned, demographic decline. Why don't the Chinese want to have children or have more children?
Bueno, porque se han enriquecido los países a medida que se enriquecen.
Well, because countries have become wealthier as they develop. This is proof that China is much richer than the statistics suggest. There are certain studies showing how all countries in the world, as they have grown wealthier, have gradually stopped having children, for obvious reasons. In an African country, a very poor country, by the time your child is 6 years old, they go from being a cost to being functional labor that helps the family. They can already work in the fields and become a profitable workforce.
Ya es una fuerza de trabajo rentable. A medida que un país se enriquece, lo vemos en
As a country becomes wealthier, we see it in the West, and they're already seeing it in China. A child is not a cost at age 6 or 12 or 15. They're a cost for 30 years of your life, because at 30 they still haven't left home, and you still have to pay for 2 more master's degrees so they can find the job of their dreams. They're not quite there yet in China, but they're already seeing that evolution. They're already realizing that it's no longer enough to pay for the child's college education. You have to pay for it at the best university possible, ideally abroad. A college degree is no longer enough. It has to be a master's or a doctorate. And the child, instead of being a profitable investment in that Chinese pragmatism, becomes a huge and long-term burden. Well, all countries have more or less come to those conclusions. The Chinese just got there first.
Más o menos a esas conclusiones, los chinos han llegado antes.
Bien, y la última sobre lo de las relaciones internacionales.
Well, and lastly, about international relations. Within the framework of your whole perspective on China, what kind of relationship should countries establish with China? It's very complex.
Incluso también con China. Bueno, en el marco de todo lo hablado en esta conversación.
Spain, of course, has no decision-making power. Spain has delegated its diplomatic functions to the European Union, and the European Union has in fact delegated its diplomatic functions to the United States, which means there is no possible negotiating power to bring positions closer to China. The European Union is making some moves, but Spain can do little in that regard. In Latin America, yes, Latin America still, beyond the fact that we often, perhaps a bit offensively, define some countries as the backyard of the United States. In some places, still speaks of an old concept that some may remember from old books, called, I don't know, sovereignty. It's a concept that maybe has already faded from our minds, and soon we'll erase it completely. The RAE will remove it because it's fallen out of use. But in places where that's still seen as a value, they can indeed reach agreements. I often say, this isn't about being pro-China. I'm not putting on a China jersey, although maybe your audience, after everything I've said, will think, you've brought Xi Jinping's nephew here to talk about how great China is. No, I'm a trader. Sometimes I call myself a merchant, the worst word, that capitalist you hate, that's me. And I'm in China not because I like the party or because I believe in communist or capitalist ideas. I'm in China because I can make money. It's that simple. I'm in China because I can thrive here. And I've seen how hundreds of thousands of American companies have come to China to set up their factories because they could thrive here. Without ideology, money has no ideology. So, what would I say to the countries of Latin America? It's not a matter of being pro-China or pro-United States. It's a matter of being pro-each country. Pro each one. Pro-Argentine for Argentines. Pro-Mexican for Mexicans. Pro-Chilean for Chileans. So what is best at each moment for my country? I was at the inauguration of the Chancay port in Peru, and I remember that one of the questions I was asked at one of the conferences was, the United States proposes building a parallel port here in Peru to compete with the Chancay port. What should we do? And they asked me as if I were going to say, no, you should go with the Chinese. The Chinese are more trustworthy. What I told them was, of course, anything that can enrich you, anything that gives you more sovereignty so you can choose at any moment your best option, that's much better. The problem is that the United States has spent almost a century neutralizing a number of countries so they wouldn't have the power to choose. And today we see it with constant threats against Chinese companies, with threats to countries, with threats to members of Congress if they don't approve the blockades against companies like Huawei. So that's not capitalism. That has nothing to do with capitalism. That has to do with an imperialism that makes us, under threat or coercion, try with a still colonial Eurocentric mindset to force countries to do what we want by force. Then China comes to your countries to trade, to offer you a better deal. And if the deal isn't better, don't choose it. It's as simple as that. Listen to the deal China is offering, and if it's better, choose it. But they came to buy a mine in my country. Well, they must have come to buy a mine because someone was selling one. And if it was sold to the Chinese, it's because they made the best possible offer. And that's what we should aim for, to have a larger pool of buyers. And of course, I want to have the best buyer in that pool. I don't want to push it aside just because Daddy United States tells me to. I want all buyers to be able to make their best offer. And the more buyers there are, and the wealthier they are, the better deal I can get for my natural resources, for the establishment of a BYD factory in my country, or for the establishment of a factory from an American brand. I don't care. Say Ford. So to me, what I think has happened in Latin America, and generally, in the world, Africa is waking up. It has awakened a lot. Southeast Asia, especially, is negotiating much more with the Chinese. Is that over the last, I'd say almost a century, there's been one country that has imposed its imperialism and limited the buyer's options. So I think it's great that culturally the Americans are the kings. Fantastic. But if someone comes along and makes me a better offer than you, I'd like to be able to choose it. That would be ideal for me. So how do we transform this? How do we channel these ideas? By improving the diplomatic relations that exist between each of our countries and China, since China is usually the largest trading partner of every Latin American country. If not the first, then the second. So how is that possible? I sometimes say Latin America turns its back on China, and I've given lectures in most Latin American countries, and it's very curious because I used to think it was a political issue. But when you look at Latin America's relations with Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, I've realized once again that we can separate out the political component. It's not a matter of China being communist, or China being authoritarian, or China being capitalist. It's a matter of you living with your backs turned to Asia. You've always looked north, and when it wasn't the United States, it was Europe as the main destination. So I believe Latin America needs to look much more toward the Pacific, to look much more toward the region that's growing the fastest in the world. Today it's China, but, as I said, the fastest growing region in the world is Southeast Asia. And there are countless opportunities, both for buying and selling. They're the world's factory, but also the world's largest market, and we're missing out on it because of ideological disputes.
All right, I completely agree with your analysis. Adrián, let's wrap up the conversation here. Let's wrap up the talk here. It's been a real privilege having you with us. As is our custom on our channel, toward the end we give our guests the chance to close with whatever they like. A bit of promotion, if you want, for your channel or your activities, a reflection, whatever you like. The mic is open for your closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much. Ezequiel, I felt right at home. And well, not much promotion. With the name that appears on screen, Adrián Díaz Marro, you can find me on all social media, and there you'll see everything I do. And above all, since you're giving me this opportunity, that message I often repeat because it seems like I'm here to promote China and make you fall in love with China and make your whole audience adore China. I often say, I don't even expect you to like China. I don't even aim that high. I just want you to see the opportunity that beyond whether you like or dislike a country, you see the opportunity to make the most of it. I usually say China is the place where things happen. So you can't live with your back turned to the things that happen in the place where things happen. I recommend people take a look. It's incredible. We often say that all of humanity's knowledge fits in our pocket. It's incredible how much misinformation there is about China today, considering that supposedly all of humanity's knowledge fits in our pocket. We're just one click away from being able to refute all those myths and false ideas that have been instilled in us about China, from being able to open our minds. And sometimes I say, okay, I don't know anything about China, but I don't know anything about Uganda either. Fine, but Uganda doesn't have the same weight in your life that China does. If you look in the mirror, look at everything you're wearing, look at where your phone comes from, look at where your computer comes from. I usually say, your clothes are China, the past, your phone is Chinese, the present, and your next car will be Chinese, the future. So, how is it possible that you know nothing about the country that most influences your life? I understand that the United States has greatly affected our lives, because it could invade us at any moment, it could change our ruler. It's normal that we know a lot about the United States, because it affects us so much. But if we set aside the military, political, and all the intervention they've carried out in our countries, on a commercial level, on the level of voluntary agreements, the country we interact with the most, curiously, voluntarily, is China. Yet we know nothing about them. So as I said, to wrap up here, it doesn't matter whether we like them or not. I don't mean that we have to like them, only that since we're going to interact with them, whether we want to or not, through all the products we buy, we should at least be minimally informed about that country.
Mil gracias, Adrián. A los demoledores.
1,000 thanks, Adrián. To the demolishers, both men and women, thank you very much for joining us. To our moderator, Beatriz Pulido, of course, our thanks as well. In half an hour, Fernando Moragon's program begins on our sister channel, MP Geopolitics. Don't miss it. Goodbye, everyone. Bye-bye.
A todo el mundo, chau, chau.
Chao, chao.
Yeah.